If you're interested, you can visit the setting of today's story at Malabar Farm State Park in Lucas, Ohio. The airy old house that was the home to the Rose family in 1896 still stands. The father, David, ran the mill on the property, and he lived with his wife, Rebecca, their son, Walter, and their 23-year-old daughter, Ceely. Malabar Farm is now in Ohio State Park and has been named one of the 10 most haunted places in America.
I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is Hard Times and True Crimes. So how's your week been so far, Melody?
Well, it's been a doozy.
One of those weeks, huh?
Yeah.
Well, so I found out that one of my children and his wife are having a little girl.
Yay.
So that'll be my second granddaughter. And tonight I'm going to find out if if my other son and his wife are having a boy or a girl.
That's exciting.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah. I did get to play a prank on you just a few minutes ago about that. Your oldest son, when I was coming in, they said they had just found out what they were having. I said, "Oh, what is it?" And they paused for a second. And I said, "Oh, never mind. I guess you're probably going to have a gender reveal." He said, "No, but we haven't told Mom yet, but tell her you know." He said, "Just to get her." And so I came in and Darlene was sitting here and I just was like, "Oh, I'm so excited. They just told me what they're having." But it was a joke. I have no clue.
You're thinking a girl, right?
I feel like it's a girl.
Yeah, I do too.
And that said, I am always wrong. We'll have to tell next week what it was. Okay.
So, what are you drinking? You don't know.
I don't know.
I don't either. Lily picked us up coffees this morning from Nanny Mae's. We just know that they're sugar-free, and we both took a sip, and we're like, oh my gosh, these are so good.
So good. Yeah. And that caffeine is hitting me, I can tell, because I'm feeling really peppy
Jittery.
right now. Yeah.
I had a latte yesterday from Bold. And it was a coconut.
Oh, that's
white chocolate. Oh my gosh.
That's their new summer menu?
Yes.
I got a text saying that their new one was out.
It was delicious.
That said, Nanny Mae's and Bold have both sponsored our shows before with coffees, and we appreciate them. And we still frequent both of those.
They're great. Okay, so I'm going to get into today's story, all right?
Okay.
My main source is The Ceely Rose Murders at Malabar Farms by Mark Sebastian Jordan. So David and Rebecca Rose were married on February 8th in 1855 by Justice of Peace in Concord Township of Ohio. The next year in 1856, Rebecca gave birth to their first child, which was a son that they named John. But sadly, John didn't live to even be a year old.
Oh.
The infant mortality rate was extremely high in the backwoods of Ohio. But on December 1st of 1857, that next year, another child was born, a healthy baby boy that they named Walter Rose. And then 2 years later, in 1859, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter named Julia Ann. Now, David was a miller. He had grown up watching his father, and so that's really all he'd ever known. And he must have been a pretty good provider because by 1860, after just 5 years of marriage, the Roses had over 80 acres of land. 7 of those acres were cleared and used. They had a horse, a milk cow, and 5 hogs, as well as 60 bushels of Indian corn to feed the hogs. So the Roses, they weren't doing too bad for themselves.
Yeah, sounded like they were prospering.
But then in 1861, the Civil War would break out. David enlisted on September 8th of that year. He would serve as a miller for the army, providing food for the Union troops. Now, that was his primary role, but then, of course, as the war raged on, he would find himself on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. He was marked as a deserter in August of 1862. It really wasn't that uncommon.
For people to desert.
Yeah. And I had always thought you would be shot on the spot, but it didn't really happen that way. Apparently, it was pretty common. It usually wasn't even a sign of cowardice. A short explanation, in case you missed, the episodes where we discussed it, is that the men on both sides of the battle although, most loved their country and they believed in the cause, were under the impression that this conflict was going to be over in just a few short months. But as months turned to years, many soldiers, they felt conflicted between their duties to their countries and then their duties to their wives and children back at home. Mm-hmm. Their families were by themselves. And for wealthy women who, maybe had slaves or servants or women who had families nearby, that might not have been such a hard thing. But for women like Rebecca, who lived in backwoods Appalachia, Ohio, alone with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, couldn't have been easy. She was having to plant and plow and feed, the livestock she had and just try to keep everybody alive.
Yeah. She's trying to do both jobs, his and hers.
Sure.
And I guess, all the women during that time those were hard times.
They really were. But I think the difference too is in her situation, just being back so far, she didn't have a large community of help.
Right.
A lot of times if you were in town, people just kind of pitched in together and they would go from farm to farm. But I don't know that she had that.
She was truly alone.
If their husbands cared at all, they worried about their families.
Yes.
And so I'm sure David worried about Rebecca and his children. And so that probably was the cause of his desertion in August. And I'd imagine he probably helped his wife get some work done. But he did return back to his duty station and accepted his consequences. Then on April 17th, he deserted again before returning 2 weeks later. I'm sure there was probably a reason for that as well.
Yeah, it sounds like he was just like taking a break to go home and help and make sure everything's okay. But he's coming back.
Yes.
So he's not just like,
completely, deserting. No. In the beginning of May in 1864, David got super sick with diarrhea. So sick that he had to be admitted to the hospital. And actually, that was pretty common. A lot of soldiers died from diarrhea and dysentery and things like that because of unsanitary living conditions.
Yeah.
They were getting typhoid and cholera, all kind of stuff.
And syphilis.
Exactly.
Remember we talked about that with Tom Dooley?
Yes, we did. Now, soldiers, they were ordered to bathe once every week, but they almost never did.
I wonder why.
I don't know. I can't imagine.
I think they would be really wanting.
Excited to do that, but yeah.
Well, maybe if it was cold and they were out, maybe if it was the winter time and they didn't really want to go in the creek and get a bath.
Right. And they didn't, I don't think, realize the importance of it like we do today.
Sure.
Plus, there were tons of manure from like livestock all around the camp. And slaughtered animals' carcasses added to the filth in these war camps. Can you imagine the stench?
So they might not even have known how bad they smelled.
Exactly. Well, anyway, David was finally released back to his regiment on June 30th of that year. And then David deserted again a final time in November of 1865. And this time he never went back. Later, years later, in 1890, when David Rose applied for disability, he still suffered from effects and health problems related to his time in the service. He had kidney problems, stomach issues, constant diarrhea, partial deafness from gunfire, and then he'd also lost his right eye. So he
did suffer.
He did, yeah. They gave David partial disability, and he got $12 a month.
Wow. I didn't even know they had disability back then.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So we don't know exactly what life was like for David and Rebecca after the war. They lived hard, mostly separate lives for years. I'm sure both were changed by their experiences. Lots of married couples, they had babies after the war from having been separated for so long. That wasn't the case for David and Rebecca. But I do believe they loved each other. When he came back, Rebecca, she wasn't mean. She maybe ran the family.
Okay.
Maybe
sense. Wore the pants, or maybe not.
I think so. I think she had more of the business sense. She was just able to kind of control everybody in the family, keep everything going, but not in a mean way.
She's the home manager.
Yes. That's a very good descriptive word.
That's what I am at my house.
Yeah. I mean,
you can take that out.
There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's great. But yeah, so 8 years later, though, and they were getting on up there in age.
Okay.
On March 13th of 1873, a baby girl was born.
Oh.
Her name was Celia Frances Rose, 14 years younger than their youngest daughter, Julia.
Oh, well, my kids are like that.
Well, back then, though, women went through the change of life much earlier.
Oh, really?
So by 40 years old, they were completely done.
Oh, I had no idea.
And in menopause, yes. She had her at 39.
That's funny. Yeah, she was way up in age. I had my last one at 40, but
right. Yeah, I know. But
I know what you're saying, though. When I did have my last child at 40.
Right.
And my girls were, teenagers. My oldest one, she was 15 when I had Titus. And when we would go to the store and she's holding him, people would always assume he was hers and not mine. And she did not like that at all. And I'm like, no, that's my baby. But they assumed it was her baby. Yeah.
Because of the
age, yeah.
Well, I think it was the case here too. A lot of people
suspected
suspected that the baby belonged to Julia. Nobody knows for sure if she really was David and Rebecca's, but it could have been like a
menopause baby.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe she wasn't all the way through menopause.
Right. In 1876, Julia, the youngest, did marry a man named John Long, and she had a baby in 1878, and she may have died in childbirth because by 1880, she had disappeared completely from all census records. And her little boy, John Jr., was living with his grandmother on the dad's side. Just after the death of their daughter in 1879, that's why they suspect she probably died the year before that, David and Rebecca all of a sudden packed up their belongings, their youngest daughter, Celia, that they had nicknamed Ceely, and their oldest son, Walter. They sold their land in Pike County, and they moved 150 miles away, where they purchased an old mill and a small 2-story house for the Miller's family in southern Richland County in Pleasant Valley. And then now it's Malabar Farm State Park.
Oh.
So, yeah. And the house is actually still standing to this day.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. So I'll post some pictures of that on our Facebook group. But the family raised hogs, and they had a big vegetable and herb garden. And David worked. He restored that mill because it was a very old mill. Even though his health was pretty wrecked by that time, his son Walter, who was 23 when they made the move, helped his dad quite a bit. Walter also worked as a day laborer on other farms, when there wasn't work for him at the mill. A lot of people think that the son, because he was older and he never married.
Okay.
And so a lot of people think just weird that he didn't marry, but he may have felt like he couldn't because his parents were getting up in age, and Ceely, she was a little bit slow.
Okay.
So she wouldn't have been able to tend to her parents.
Okay. So maybe he might have felt obligated.
Yeah, because by this time they definitely were aging.
Gotcha.
Rebecca, she had a loom in her front room where she would loom rugs and help out financially. They weren't well-to-do, but they weren't destitute either. They did what they had to do to get by, but worked hard for every bit of what they had. And then, like I said, Ceely, bless her heart, she was a little slow. Now we would call her mentally challenged. She is an interesting little girl because now when the family moved to Pleasant Valley, she went to the Valley School. But Ceely was so far behind her peers socially, mentally, and academically that everybody made fun of her and didn't want anything to do with her. To make her stand out even more, she stuttered. And she had this really strange habit of laughing at inappropriate times. So the kids nicknamed her Silly Ceely. I know. Or Ceely Rose, they would call her.
Yeah.
She ended up hanging around kids who were a lot younger than her, like kindergartners, who treated her well until they were old enough to be influenced.
Right.
By the older kids.
As that does happen.
It's sad.
It is sad.
But Ceely, I don't think it was how she would have wanted it, but she became pretty antisocial. She would play in the woods for hours by herself. She had a little dollhouse that she would sit and play with. She did not help her mother with chores. You were not going to make Ceely do anything she did not want to do. The only one that could really control her was her mom. She called her Ma, but her Ma was pretty easy on her, I think, just because she knew she had so many hard things to deal with in life. But that really kind of aggravated people around. They just felt like her mom was older, and it was just expected. Even young kids, they did a lot of work back then. And so it really frustrated people, that Ceely didn't help out more around there. But she could read really well, and she loved books. She'd read them over and over again. And I mean, like big books. She'd read the Bible, and she loved fairy tales. And she had this remarkable ability to remember facts about what she had read. So I wonder if she was maybe autistic.
That's what I'm wondering.
Now, a lot of her teachers didn't believe she understood those facts. Like, they just thought she could just spout them off. But I don't know. As the story goes on, I don't know that that's true. But they didn't think that she had any original thoughts of her own, if that makes sense. And they didn't think she was capable of, like, figuring things out. But Ceely did go to school until she was 20 years old, until her teacher spoke to Rebecca and told her that Ceely was not going to progress any further, and that maybe it was time for her to just stop attending school. Her teachers later said that she never really progressed past the first grade, but that just doesn't seem true across the board. I mean, maybe there were some areas.
Well, reading is a pretty big one. And if she was reading big books and, in the Bible, I'm thinking she had to have been well beyond a first grade level.
Absolutely. And not only that, but she was not terrible at math.
We'll be back after a quick break.
At the beginning of this year, one of my New Year's resolutions was to get my home decluttered and organized, especially my kitchen. Just going in there felt daunting. Even family meals were no longer enjoyable. I knew that I needed help because the thought of tackling it on my own was overwhelming. And then Melody told me about Shannon over at Functional Spaces. And let me tell you that meeting her transformed my kitchen from a cluttered mess to a cozy functional space that I once again can take pleasure in.
Everyone has that one chaotic area in their home that requires excessive time and energy to manage. Many of us can identify more than one. For Darlene, that was just inside her kitchen door.
Yes, everybody would come in and throw mail, keys, and coats all over the counters and chairs. I told Shannon this was such a source of stress for me. Why couldn't everybody just put their stuff away? And she explained that we could easily turn that area into a place of peace and productivity, a true functional space. We added a coat rack with key hooks and a small mail bin, and that has been a game changer. That's just one example of the difference she made.
Functional Spaces is based in the Triangle and serves Central North Carolina. If you're ready to experience that same transformation, go to functionalspacesnc.com and fill out the contact form. You will receive a link to schedule your discovery call to chat about your project area. Again, that's functionalspacesnc.com. Tell her your friends at Hard Times and True Crime sent you. Maybe they were making some assumptions based on her social skills or something.
That's what I kind of think. Yeah. By the mid-1890s, Ceely was a physically developed woman, though. She was pretty tall. She was my height. She was 5'7", and she weighed about between 160 and 170 pounds. Pretty average today. By 1898, at 23 years old, she was flooded with natural womanly hormones. If you know what I mean.
Yes, but I'm sitting here thinking, I hope somebody's not going to take advantage of her because I know. I just feel like this is going there.
Well, she didn't really have the mental capacity to know what to do with these feelings, and she became obsessed with boys.
Okay.
She talked a lot about wanting to get married, wanting to have a family of her own, and she wanted to be the ma of her house. Like, she really looked up to her ma, like her ma was in charge, and she wanted that too. Now, she could do some basic household chores and a little cooking, but Ceely was not capable of living on her own.
Well, I was going to say, she didn't really learn how to do that when she didn't help her mom that much.
Exactly. So she couldn't take care of herself, much less a husband and children. But that was her dream, nevertheless. She fantasized about it and talked about it day and night. She would try to talk to boys. She'd go down to where they were playing ball and cheer for whoever was winning. She'd go into town and try to talk to different boys. And she finally developed a crush on this local farmer named Clem Herring, he was pretty close to her age. And she tried talking to him. I mean, he didn't want to be rude, but he was not interested. When she wrote him a love letter and gave it to him, he just kind of politely thanked her, but dodged her even more. Just went out of his way to make sure he did not have to speak to her. When she realized that that wasn't going anywhere, Ceely set her sights on another local farmer named Carrie Andrews. It makes you sad, doesn't it?
It does. I feel bad for her.
And he was really cruel to her. He just kind of laughed in her face and just mean.
Yeah.
Pure meanness. I don't know how much it hurt her feelings if she had that capacity, or you know what I mean? Like if things bothered her like that, I'm not sure. The Rose's closest neighbors were the Berries, and they lived about 20 yards away, which by those standards and by that time, that was close.
I was going to say, that's not that far.
No, though it was too close as far as those families were concerned. They could see each other's front doors and windows. The Berry's son was a handsome, popular 16-year-old boy named Guy Berry. And Ceely could watch him from her window while he worked.
And so he's 16 and she's 20?
She's 23.
Oh, 23. Okay.
Yes. And so she'd watch him work out in the garden and while he was tending the animals. She just talked about that boy constantly. She would go over and follow him around the yard. And Guy was different than the other boys because he wasn't unkind to Ceely.
Well, good. At least he wasn't.
He kind of felt sorry for her, and he didn't want to be mean like he'd seen other kids doing. And so he'd carry on a conversation with her. And when she'd come over, he'd let her talk, and he just tried his best to be kind. He'd smile when she'd say something awkward, and it was just generally polite. Nothing more, though. But Ceely misunderstood.
Oh, but she took the kindness for reciprocal feelings.
Yes, and she was convinced that he was in love with her.
Aww.
So this kind of amped her up a little bit. And she started, I mean, really, today it would probably be considered stalking.
Oh, goodness.
If he was outside, she was outside. And if he wasn't outside, she would knock on the door. I mean, she was over there all the time. And one day she told him they were going to get married in 3 years when he was 19. And Guy was like, hold up. I never said that. We are definitely not getting married. And so Ceely, she tried to make him jealous by telling him if he didn't marry her, then she was going to be forced to marry one of these other 3 guys who were in love with her and pressuring her to marry them. But the next day she came back over and she told him, she was like, I'm sorry. I'll never marry anybody but you.
Oh, goodness. I feel so bad for her.
I know. She was in love with him.
Yeah.
And she told him that. She was like, I love you and only you. After that, Guy, he really tried to avoid her too. Like, he was like, this is getting out of hand. So she started going around, though, telling other people in the town that she and Guy were courting and that they were going to get married. And you can imagine how well that went over for Guy with all the other boys and kids in the community. So one day his younger brother, Claude, came out when Ceely had came over looking for Guy. And he told her, Guy doesn't like you like that. He likes somebody else, and he's not going to marry you. And so Ceely's response was, then fine, then I'll marry you. Wow. And Claude was like, no. He was 12 years old, and she was in her 20s. So eventually, Guy went to his dad, and he said, I'm going to run away. If you cannot get her to stop, I'm leaving. And so Mr. Berry, as much as he hated it, decided he was going to have a talk with his neighbor, Mr. Rose.
Yeah.
So he and Mr. Rose, they didn't hate each other, but they were not friends either. It was just an awkward neighborly relationship for some reason. And I really think they were both nice people. So I don't know why it was like that. A lot of people tried to paint Ceely's dad as like this mean, overbearing guy, but I do not believe that. I heard an account from one of the neighborhood girls who said she would go over to their house with her mother when she was young. And she said she never wanted to be in the house because that lumen wheel was so loud. And so she would follow Mr. Rose around. And she said he was always covered in flour, because he was the miller. And he would joke with her and just was so sweet. And she said he always gave her candy. So he just doesn't strike me as a jerk.
Right. They just weren't each other's cup of tea.
And it may just be the close proximity. They both had livestock. I'm sure there was just those neighborly issues. Yeah. They were very close neighbors.
I was going to say probably that proximity is the big deal, because back then neighbors didn't live that close unless you were in the town.
Right. And that's what I think too.
Yeah.
David Rose, he did have a reputation for being a little standoffish and stern, I guess. But Mr. Barry knew, look, I still got to talk to him for my boy's sake. So he went over and told Mr. Rose, look, please keep Ceely home. She's driving my boys crazy. She will not leave him alone. She's spreading lies saying that she and Guy are getting married. And now my son, he's threatening to run away. Just keep her away from us. And Mr. Rose was mortified.
Oh, I bet.
Can you imagine? He was probably so embarrassed. And he was probably mad as fire at Ceely. But also, he probably felt bad for her.
I'm sure all of those things.
Yeah.
I'm sure he felt all of those things.
So he called Ceely up to the meal and he let her have it. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Why are you saying these things? You stay away from that boy. You don't mention his name again. I do not want to hear another word about Guy Barry. You are not marrying him. Keep his name out of your mouth and do not go back over there. So she promised her dad. She said, I won't go over there if you promise not to tell Ma.
Oh, now I wonder why she didn't want her mom to know. She was embarrassed?
I think she was embarrassed.
Yeah.
And so he said he would not. And apparently nobody, I think I mentioned before, nobody could control Ceely quite like her ma could.
Right. That's why she didn't want her mom to know.
Right. She was strong-willed, Ceely was. And, a lot of times nobody could do nothing with her. And she would throw tantrums. She would bite people sometimes and hit them. But her mama did not play those games. And Ceely knew it. But at some point, somehow, I guess it got out. And he told his wife. It's hard to keep secrets like that from your spouse.
Yeah.
And Ceely she was reprimanded again. And probably so embarrassed all over again. And her brother, Walter, he chimed in, put his 2 cents in there. And she was just humiliated and she was mad.
Poor girl.
I know. But surprisingly, the next day she had calmed down and she agreed, okay, I won't go over there anymore and I'll stop this. And she actually started changing for the better. She started doing more to help her mom around the house. She stopped going over to the Barrys. And it really looked like all of that was behind them.
Okay. I was expecting you to say that she just continued to sneak over there. I was not expecting that. Okay.
No. And Rebecca was really proud of the changes that she saw Ceely making. But actually, she was brooding over the situation. She was mad that she wasn't allowed to talk about him anymore. And she was hurt. And she believed that her family was standing in between her and her future husband and to marry Guy.
He's told her that he's not going to marry her.
He's told her very plainly. I think, there are some things that I wonder if there was not a little something maybe going on.
Oh, maybe like he might have let her on a little bit.
I don't know. Well, you'll hear later on in the story. I don't know. I don't know if she was making... Yeah, we'll see. We'll talk about it.
Okay.
Ceely remembered a story that her pa had been following in the newspaper the year before, and I'm actually going to cover this story too. And it was a very sensational story about a young man named Romulus Cattell. He had confessed to and was convicted of murdering a Mr. and Mrs. Stone, as well as their farmhand. Cattell used to work for this family in Talmadge, Ohio, which was pretty close to where they lived. He had been fired and replaced with this new farmhand. And after some intense interrogation, Cattell admitted to beating the family with a baseball bat before slashing their bodies with a knife. He had been in love with one of the daughters, Flora. He had intended also to kill her sisters because he wanted to get rid of the entire family so that Flora would be heir to the farm and he would marry her and they would have a good financial start.
Oh, goodness.
And Ceely remembered this story and she didn't think it sounded like a terrible plan.
Oh, gosh.
In fact, eliminating obstacles that stood in the way of love, it sounded kind of romantic as far as she was concerned.
Wow.
So obviously she didn't have the strength to, beat her family to death or anything like that. And I don't know that she necessarily wanted to do that, but, these were just some thoughts that were going through her head.
Because of something she had already heard. It planted a seed, maybe?
It did.
Okay.
It did plant a seed. And then on the morning of June 26th in 1896, Ceely helped her mom make breakfast because, like I said, she was doing more around to help. And, like I said, Rebecca really appreciated that. Ceely set out some coffee. She set out some schmearcase. Do you know what that is?
No, I've never heard of that.
It's the German word for cottage cheese.
Oh, wow. Say it again.
Schmearcase.
Okay, I eat a lot of cottage cheese. I'm going to start calling it a
schmearcase.
I like it.
That with some tinned cherries and some butter and bread. So that was the family's breakfast that morning. And it was a typical summer breakfast.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it really does. Her pa had been pretty hungry that morning and he needed food for energy, for work. So he ate quite a bit and so did Walter. Walter now, he's in his late 30s.
Okay.
He's about 39. Ma, she ate less than everybody else just because, she just wasn't as hungry and she wasn't sick or anything. She just didn't feel like eating a whole bunch that morning. Ceely, she put some on her plate, but she did not eat. Now, her dad looked over and said, Ceely, why aren't you eating? And she just played it off and said, I am, but she picked at it until everybody was through eating. Then her pa and brother headed off to work while Ceely and her ma cleared up. Ceely made sure she handled getting rid of all the leftovers. When they finished, Ma went on about her housework when all of a sudden she started feeling sick on her stomach.
Bum, bum, bum.
Yes. And before Ceely knew it, Ma was on the floor violently vomiting and foaming at her mouth.
Wow.
And Ceely just stood over her watching with this morbid curiosity. And she even had to put her hand over her mouth so that Ma couldn't see her laughing.
Oh, that's horrible.
Because she was so surprised that it was working so fast.
Wow.
And she had this weird habit of laughing at awkward times.
Probably when she was like nervous or something.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Rebecca whispered for Ceely to go get her paw, like she could hardly even talk. So Ceely ran up to the mill, and when David got back home and saw how sick Rebecca was, he was, of course, he knew something was wrong. So he hitched up his horse and wagon and took off to go get the doctor. Well, his regular doctor wasn't at home. He was on a house call. But thankfully, there was a new, younger doctor named John McCombs, and he was available. So he rode with David, and they headed back to the Rose place. On the way, though, David was struck with this extreme thirst. He had to stop at a farmhouse to get water. Like, he couldn't even make it home, knowing his wife was at home. So he just had to stop. It was that bad. As soon as he started drinking the water, his body just had this immediate reaction, and he started uncontrollably vomiting and just over and over again and crying out with just this agonizing pain in his stomach. Finally, the doctor was able to get him back to the house, where they also found Walter, the Rose's 39-year-old son. He too was severely sick. Some neighbors had found him passed out in a ditch and had carried him back to his house. Now, Dr. McCombs had first gone to school to be a lawyer. This was the new doctor, the one that was there, before he had trained as a doctor. It really worked out well that this new doctor had just happened to be the one that come that day, because by the time he went to medical schools, they were training physicians to look for symptoms of poisoning. Older doctors, like the Rose's regular physician, wouldn't have known the signs. They would have been diagnosed with something.
Yes. Okay.
And probably too, having trained as a lawyer first, he was almost immediately suspicious of Ceely. Everybody in her house was critically ill except for her.
Right.
So he asked Ceely, if she'd eaten the same breakfast with the rest of the family. And she said yes. And, my stomach hurts too. But she was not displaying any of those severe symptoms that the rest of the family was. The doctor asked if she had fixed the breakfast for everybody that morning. But before she could answer, Rebecca, as weak and sick as she was, spoke up and said, "I fixed it."
Wait, Rebecca wasn't dead yet. She's just sick and
she's
very
just sick.
sick. Oh, my goodness.
Ceely had started to speak.
Yeah.
But her mom spoke up and she stopped talking.
Wait, but why did her mom do that? Because Ceely had helped her. But the mom said, "I did it. I fixed it."
Yes.
Was she covering for her?
Yes, I believe so.
Oh, goodness.
He wrote down all of the Rose's symptoms, and he went and wired the Richland County Sheriff and prosecutor in Mansfield, and he told them, look, I'm really suspicious about this. This does not look right. But their responses, they were like, it sounds like food poisoning to me. They had eaten cottage cheese.
Just blew him off.
They did. One of those men, the sheriff, actually grew up in Pleasant Valley, and he owned a farm just up from the Roses. And so he probably knew Ceely and just couldn't imagine that she was capable of something like that.
Yeah.
Neighbors would stop by, during the next few days, helping in any way that they could. They brought herbal teas and they brought salves for their lips because they were getting blisters on their mouths from so much vomiting.
But they still have not died.
No, they're all three at this point alive. Now, this is not even the next day yet.
Okay.
Rebecca, though, she was in a little bit better shape than David and Walter. She could even sit up and talk some. But David, he was laid up on the couch, unable to hardly even move. And Walter was laid out on a cot in the back room, and they just vomited and vomited and vomited. I mean, it was terrible.
How horrible would that be?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really.
And season. I mean, it was bad.
Yeah.
The day after all this, the Roses family physician, Dr. Alan Budd, he came home, and he ended up taking over their care. After looking over everything, Dr. Budd asked the family about the possibility of poison. And none of them said that they thought it was a possibility. 5 days later, though, he concluded that he too believed that it was arsenic poisoning. And he started treating the sick family members with iron as an antidote, because I guess that's what they did. But, it had been 5 days. Yeah. And it didn't make any difference for David or Walter. David struggled with agonizing stomach pains for 6 days until the night of Tuesday, June 30th, when he passed away.
Wow, that is a long time to suffer. I mean, probably excruciating the whole time. Can you imagine?
Oh, I know. They didn't even tell his wife that night because she was still reeling from these effects, and they just didn't want to do anything to set her back. The next morning, the undertaker came and picked up his body, but first they wanted to perform an autopsy. Now, they took out David's stomach and intestines, and those did show that he had been poisoned with arsenic. There was a test that they could do that it would really show definitively, but this test that they could do, it was expensive. And they weren't 100% convinced that, even though the doctor was saying it, the prosecutor and the sheriff, they just weren't really buying it. And so they decided not to do that test. But still, the doctor believed that it was arsenic poisoning. And like I said, they had the blisters around their mouth, their intestines, the stomach showed symptoms, everything did. So he and probably didn't really match any of the major diseases that would go around during then. I would guess maybe. Exactly. They held David's funeral at the Pleasant Valley Lutheran Church, and David Rose was buried in that church graveyard in a plot. His neighbors helped get together a site for him. His wife was devastated when she found out.
Yeah.
She was just heartbroken and so sad. Almost another full week passed with Walter suffering horribly.
Good gracious. Poor
He
guy.
had, oh, I know. He had those burn-like blisters all around his mouth. He was so thirsty, but he could not drink anything because
Did it burn?
It vomiting. Like it would just, he would just throw up, and he could not. Eventually, all around his mouth just turned pure black.
Oh, that's horrible.
And he was dying of dehydration pretty much.
Like
literally dying of thirst.
A very long, slow, painful death.
2 weeks.
That's awful. I think that's the longest I've heard of anybody dying from arsenic. Wow.
The doctors did their best to keep him comfortable. You know, his neighbors would come and they would wet his cracked lips. One girl was saying that she took salve over and that the mom, Mrs. Rose, was like, "You're such a good girl for bringing him," you know.
Yeah.
And she said she was horrified because his lips were pure black. He could not be saved. And Walter died on July 4th in 1896.
Wow.
By this time, the Pleasant Valley community, they were wanting answers.
Yeah.
And it couldn't be ignored anymore, you know? So an official investigation did start. Newspapers had already started following the Rose case and reporting every rumor going around. And of course, you know, there were lots of them. When Rebecca Rose, the mother, testified at the coroner's inquest, she said that she had prepared the breakfast, though, by herself, and she denied that Ceely had helped her at all.
So she's like covering for her.
Yep. And
Wow.
she stuck to that story no matter what.
I can't even imagine after seeing your husband and your son go through that kind of torture and suffering that you would still cover up.
I can't either.
But then again, I mean, it is her daughter who has maybe some kind of mental disability.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess maybe that was hard for her, but
It's hard to understand.
It
It's
is
hard to
hard.
wrap your brain
it
around.
is like, yeah.
So the prosecutor decided he was going to question Ceely. And she did seem to love being the center of attention. She was really attention starved. When asked about the breakfast that morning, she looked at her ma before she gave this clearly rehearsed answer. And then she looked back at her ma. They knew.
Like, did I say that right?
Yes,
Oh.
exactly. It was obvious that she'd been coached on what to say and that she was going to protect her daughter. At one point, though, when the prosecutor asked her, "Why did you put the poison in the coffee?" Before she thought about it, she said, "Because I wanted to."
Oh.
But then, real quick, she caught herself and said, "But I didn't put it there." Later, though, they found out that it hadn't been in the coffee, but it had been in the cottage cheese. But without a confession and with Rebecca basically covering for her, they couldn't build a case. They didn't have a case against her. And they couldn't find it. They had looked everywhere for the poison, for the remnants of it. They could not find it. Ceely did have opportunity, though, and she had a motive because they knew about this boy. But the town's opinions, they were split. You know, some people thought she was absolutely capable, while others thought there's no way. There's just no way. One man threatened, though, to string her up if she wasn't arrested. At this point, they decided to send off the organs to be tested because now they had two. So they were going to do that marsh test that I was telling you about.
Okay.
And that could be done on David and Walter. So they sent it off, and the test showed that David died from massive arsenic poisoning. There was enough arsenic in his stomach to have killed several people. And when Walter's test came back, his results were the same.
It's surprising that it worked quickly, but it didn't, like, they didn't die quickly.
I know.
Like,
Yeah.
if it was that much to kill that many people, but yet he's just hung on and suffered and suffered and
Yes.
suffered.
Yes. It's
I mean,
terrible.
That is terrible.
So now they had a double murder case
Yeah.
underway. But all they could do was wait and gather evidence because still the mom was saying she did it. She wasn't saying she did it. She was saying, "I prepared the breakfast." And they knew that if they went after them at this point, then the defense was just going to say, somebody broke in. You know, they did not really have a case.
Yeah.
What's outrageous to me, though, is that while suspecting her of murdering her family by poisoning, they continued to let her live with and take care of her mother.
Oh, goodness.
Neighbors would check in, but other than that, Ceely and Rebecca were alone most of the time.
Wow. And like, and her mother, I'm surprised her mother is not afraid to live there. I'm like,
tell me about it. But Ceely really seemed to enjoy being her mother's caretaker. She cooked her food and she would feed Rebecca buttermilk until she could handle soft foods. And then she would fix her like cornbread and buttermilk. I mean,
maybe she's feeling guilty.
I mean, that's kind of what it was looking like. Some friends and neighbors occasionally brought food, but like I said, most of the cooking was being done by Ceely. And it was kind of remarkable seeing how little she used to be willing to, she didn't want to help at all before.
So maybe it's not guilt. Maybe she still has some intent there.
Right. Well, yeah. And Ceely even did some hospitable things for a few different people in the community.
Oh, golly.
One morning in July, George and Angeline Berry, the next door neighbor,
guys, parents,
they got a knock on their door. And when they opened it, Ceely Rose was standing there with a baked pie in her hand.
Don't eat that pie.
She told Mr. Berry, I baked this for you and Mrs. Berry, but it's only for you two. Guys not allowed to eat it.
Oh, my.
So he took the pie in to his wife.
Yeah, we ain't eating this.
No. And she was like, you take that pie and you throw that out. So he did. Well, later that day, Mrs. Berry went outside to bring in some clothes, and she noticed pieces of the pie on the ground with a bunch of small peck marks in it. As she walked out further in the yard, she looked up and saw that every one of her chickens were dead all over the yard. Yes.
Oh, she dodged a bullet. I'm glad she had the foresight to know not to eat the pie.
Exactly.
Gracious.
Ceely then went back home to fix a treat for the Reverend Kramer from the Pleasant Valley Lutheran Church. He came by every week to check on Rebecca, to visit, and to pray with her. And I don't really know why.
What you got against the Reverend?
Right. But she fixed him a chicken. Thank the Lord, he had to go visit another sick parishioner that week and didn't end up stopping by. And that was the only week. So that was probably just divine intervention.
Yeah.
That worked in his favor. Rebecca, she had been feeling a lot better. She was, like I said, able to sit up and visit with friends and family a lot. She was slowly recovering. And one day, Ceely heard Dr. Budd tell her mom that she was going to survive. He explained that she needed to take things really slow and that she would have some residual effects, probably for the rest of her life. But in time, she was going to get back to a mostly normal life. Can you imagine how relieved Rebecca was?
But is she, though?
Nobody knows, what kind of talks Rebecca and Ceely had privately, when the doctors and neighbors weren't there. Rebecca probably thought Ceely had given up on this fantasy about her and Guy Berry. And she probably felt like she regretted everything. I mean, look, she had watched her father suffer. She had watched her brother suffer, had watched her mother suffer. But Ceely had not given up on Guy. She fully still believed that he was going to marry her.
Wow.
She did seem to love and respect her mother more than her father or brother, but she still believed that Rebecca was the only thing now standing between her and Guy Berry. And on the afternoon of July 18th in 1896, Rebecca asked Ceely for some buttermilk and cornbread. Ceely went out and got the buttermilk, brought it in. Rebecca's appetite, was coming back now, and she was hungry. She was enjoying her food, and she said, hey, put it in the cabinet, and I'll have some more of that later. After a little while, she'd asked for that second helping. Ceely brought it in. Yeah. And Rebecca was eating it. And she asked Ceely, why does this taste sweeter than the first serving?
All right. I'm sorry. I'm a little frustrated with her. Surely she's got better sense. Like, wouldn't she automatically be like, oh, this tastes different. Maybe I better not eat it.
Right.
Why did she keep eating it?
She ate a little more before she stopped. I mean, maybe a bite or two more. Within hours, all of her previous symptoms returned. Rebecca was in agonizing pain. She was vomiting, seizing.
Goodness.
Ceely said later she had tried her best not to laugh when her mother was vomiting up the green stuff, but she couldn't help it.
Oh my gosh. Wait a minute. She tried not to laugh, and she told them this. She's deranged.
While her mom was dying, Ceely took the pepper box that she had hid the poison in. She washed it out and she buried it. That's why they weren't able to find it. And she had just used the last bit of poison in her mom.
Yeah.
When she came back in, Rebecca said, "Ceely, if it's you that's done this, God help you. Look at me in the face, child, and tell me the truth." Ceely didn't say anything, and she just hung her head and walked out of the room.
Wow. Okay. So before, when you were talking about her mom covering for her, I thought that she knew she did it and just felt like because of her mental disabilities was just trying to protect her from maybe the consequences.
Right.
Maybe she wouldn't do well in prison kind of thing. But now, obviously, she didn't believe that she had done it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm so surprised.
It's so sad. Or if she did, maybe she thought she had learned her lesson. I don't know what she thought, but...
Well, the fact that she said, if it's you that's done this, I'm like, she obviously still even had questions.
Yeah.
Like, I realize it was, but I don't want to believe this.
Right.
Wow. Okay, sorry.
No, they sent for Dr. Budd, but of course there was nothing he could really do. He sent for the prosecutor and the sheriff immediately while he was trying to at least keep Rebecca somewhat comfortable. That's just a horrendous death.
It is, yeah.
A neighbor, Clem Herring, I don't know if you remember him, but he was one of the farmers that she had liked in the beginning.
To begin with, the first one.
Him and his mother came and they sat beside her and they wrote out Rebecca's last will and testament. Somehow, even at the end of her life, her thoughts were for Ceely. Even almost certainly knowing in her heart that she'd been poisoned by her twice now, Rebecca asked that her assets be auctioned off, and after everything was paid for, she wanted the rest to be split between Ceely and her grandson, John Long. Remember her daughter?
Yes, that had that little baby, yeah.
So that night, Rebecca died with her neighbors and her daughter by her bedside.
Wow.
Ceely wanted to stay at home. In fact, she told a girl, she said, "If I had a man, I could stay home by myself and be the ma."
Oh.
I know.
She's deranged.
Yeah.
Though. I mean, like, obviously.
But the townspeople were getting scared and angry. They're like, "Hey, how many people are going to have to die before y'all do something?
Something's got to be done."
Right. And I don't really blame them.
No.
I mean, at this point, it's crazy. So the sheriff knew the Oler family, and they were actually Ceely's biggest supporters. This older lady, she was real sweet. I got pictures of her in here, and she was super sweet. And she just couldn't believe that sweet, slow, giggly girl was capable of murdering her family. And so the Olers took Ceely into their home. And this was close to the Pleasant Valley Lutheran Church where her parents were buried. I mean, right at it. She was just as lazy there as she had been before the poisonings at her house. She spent her days reading and, playing outside. The older couple, though, they didn't really seem to mind it. They kind of enjoyed having her there. George Davis, a member of the community, had a daughter. Her name was Tracy. And Tracy and Ceely went to school together. Tracy just always been good to Ceely. She was kind of a protector to her. When the other kids would make fun of her and just be mean to her, she would take up for her. She was just a sweet girl. Mr. Davis asked his daughter if she would be willing to try to help to get Ceely to confess. So Tracy said that she would. I think she kind of felt bad about it. She'd always really liked Ceely and felt sorry for her, but she knew, this was important. So Tracy started visiting the Oler farm, and Ceely was so happy to see her friend, and they would walk and talk around the farm, and just, she had a friend. And so she was really enjoying that. Eventually, Tracy started asking some prodding questions. She had, at one point, even asked if she had poisoned her family, but she was a little smarter than Tracy had given her credit for, and she just looked at her and said, if you don't tell anybody, then maybe one day I'll tell you, or maybe I'll tell you later. But that's all she would say about it. Ceely did talk a lot, though, about Guy Barry.
She is obsessed with him.
At one point, the girls went down to the Lutheran church where the family was buried, where the grave was. Rebecca's grave, of course, is still freshly dug. They sat down and started talking, and Celia fell down on her knees, and she folded her hands and started praying. When she got up, Tracy asked if she missed her family, and Ceely said, "I miss my ma." It's just bizarre. Tracy thought of some things that might get her to talk. And she said, "Ceely, I got a secret to tell you, and I need some advice." She told her that she had fell in love with a boy and that her parents were forbidding her to be around him. She told her, she just didn't know what to do. And so, Ceely's listening to everything she's saying, and she's probably like enjoying that, she's coming to her for advice.
Nice confiding in her.
Exactly. Yeah. She said, "I know what I'd do. I'd kill him. That's what I did."
Oh,
she told Tracy that she had put Rough on Rats, which is a brand, and it's a rat poisoning, in the schmear case, which was the cottage cheese. Tracy asked her where she got it, and Ceely told her that it was Guy's idea and that he had told her to do it in the first place. Tracy asked her where she hid the poison because the sheriff or nobody was able to find it. She just kind of laughed, that silly laugh, and she said, "I was really smart, and so I hid it under a deck leaf in the yard." She told Tracy that she was like, "It's still there if you want to go see it."
Oh, okay. I didn't see that coming. Okay.
So she was like, "Okay, sure." So they ran down to Ceely's old house and got out the little tin.
Oh.
She asked Tracy, "Do you want this?" And at first she was like, "No," but then she thought, well, they may need that.
Yeah.
And so she took it.
Okay. I'm glad you said that because I've been sitting here thinking, obviously she couldn't be wearing a wire like you would today.
Right.
So I'm like, or can they just, even if she says that Ceely confessed to me, can they just take her word for that?
Well, we're going to see.
Okay.
That was smart because I would have just thought, okay, they got her.
Oh, I'm just sitting here thinking,
but you're not.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So anyway, Tracy is like, okay, well, I better get you back home. She's probably dying to like tell somebody all this.
Yeah.
Ceely tried her best to get Tracy to spend the night with her, but Tracy couldn't wait to get back. Yeah, she wanted to tell her dad everything that had happened. When they went to the prosecutor, he was excited about everything. And he, of course, was excited that she'd been smart enough to get that box. But there was a problem. There had not been a second witness.
Oh.
And that made Tracy's story hearsay.
Oh, okay.
They had to have a witness. One more witness.
Okay. Well, two things. I don't want to interrupt you for too long, but we just did that mock trial in the spring.
Yes.
So we talked a lot about hearsay. So that's why I'm sitting here going, about how can she just tell her and that's enough? And then obviously it wasn't.
Nope. If
you think about it, like even in the Bible, in the Old Testament, you couldn't be convicted by the testimony of one witness. It had to be at least two.
Yep. And that's how it was.
Yeah. Okay.
So once again, Tracy, they came up with another plan.
This should be a movie.
Yes. It's so interesting. It's a fascinating story. So Tracy visited Ceely again at the Oler farm. The girls went out to walk and talk, but this time Tracy made sure that they stayed close to the barn because her dad had hid in the loft so that he could hear the conversation between the girls. He even brought a pencil and paper so that he could take notes about what he heard her saying. Now, somehow Tracy got her to repeat the whole story again, except this time, Ceely admitted that she had lied about Guy Barry being the one to give her the poison or to tell her to poison her family. She said she would have felt terrible if he had gotten in trouble because of her. She said that the whole thing had been her idea. Tracy asked her, well, then where'd you get the poison? And she said it was there because her ma had sent Walter to the drugstore in Mansfield to get it so that they could kill tater bugs with it. But there had been some left, so Ma put it in the kitchen cabinet. And then she remembered, she saw that in the cabinet one day, and she remembered, they always told me, this stuff would kill me.
Wow.
And to stay away from it.
So, like, maybe this has been in her brain for years.
It's been in her brain since she got in trouble.
Yeah.
That time about the boy.
I mean, she wasn't a kid, but she had like the mind of a child.
Right.
And she's putting all that together. And that had been in her mind for a while.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So after she decided to use it to poison her family, she took it from the cabinet and put it in that tin box and went out and hid it. Tracy asked her, well, if God didn't tell you to do it, then who did? And Ceely laughed a little bit and said, the devil.
Well, I believe that.
Yep. She told Tracy that her ma had always told her that the devil would come and put bad thoughts in your head. But she explained to Ceely that we're supposed to push those thoughts down. But after her parents had gotten on to her about Guy and told her she couldn't see him anymore, she decided she didn't want to push him down.
Well, you know what? I think that pretty much really does sum it up, doesn't it? I mean, for her to be able to sum that up like that is pretty intuitive.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that was the truth.
Yeah, I think so.
She did say that she told Guy one day that her parents were going to die soon and that the black buggy was going to come get them and they were going to go right by his house. Tracy was like, what did he say when you said that? And she said that he told her, don't talk like that. But then she said something interesting. She said that she asked him if he had gotten the medicine. And Tracy said, well, what medicine? The medicine that would keep her from expecting or getting pregnant.
Huh.
That's interesting to me.
That is interesting. She asked him that?
Mm-hmm.
And she told Tracy that?
She said, and then I asked him.
So was he really sleeping with her?
I wonder. I don't know. Some paint him as like this totally innocent, but then there's that. So I don't know. She tried to get Ceely to elaborate more, but she said she didn't want to push her luck and stop her talking.
Yeah.
So she just changed the subject. Really, nobody knows if that was just one of her fantasies or if Guy and her really had something sexual going on.
Yeah.
I mean, for some reason, she did believe. But, you know, stalkers do sometimes.
Yeah, they get in their mind. Yeah. They're convinced. I mean, it's a delusion.
You're right. On August 12th, 1896, Ceely was arrested for the murder of her mother, father, and brother. She pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, of course, this was a big news in Ohio and, I mean, really all over the United States.
Yeah.
As you can tell, it's a pretty fascinating story. And Ceely loved the attention.
Oh, goodness.
She was loving the attention. She had all kinds of visitors, reporters, curiosity seekers, neighbors who still felt sorry for her because they believed that she was insane. But she spent her time in jail sewing, embroidering, and reading the Bible. And then also she would read this international Sunday school lesson leaf called The Story of the Bible. It's said that she really didn't show that much emotion at all, except for she was pretty cheerful and happy. She laughed a lot. She talked all the time about Guy Berry. She really was kind of detached from the death of her family, though.
Yeah. And she's still fixated on him, but detached from reality, obviously. Wow.
But then there were a lot of people at the jail. They said they didn't think she was insane, not criminally insane.
Right. I think there's a distinction.
Yeah. You can be insane and still guilty of murder.
Yeah. And she absolutely, obviously was insane. But she obviously knew right and wrong, too, because even the quote she made about the devil, she quit pushing down. Yeah. Quit pushing him away.
She didn't want to push him away anymore.
Right.
She was angry.
I mean, that kind of tells you a little bit that she knows that it was wrong.
Exactly. A lot of people thought she was kind of bright and, but then there were others who thought there was no way she knew the difference between right and wrong. She had no moral sense whatsoever. And so there was just really this great debate in their community.
Yeah.
And they were really torn. But her trial began on September 7th in 1896. Ceely was brought in from Richland County Jail when Prosecutor Douglas, when he was making his opening statements, she broke down and started crying. And I'm sure the prosecutor was like, crap, like here she is crying. They're going to feel sorry for her because she looked so childlike. I'll show you a picture of her. She really did.
And probably still acted very childlike.
She did. But then a couple of minutes later, she broke out into laughter about something else.
Well, that probably sealed her fate right there.
It was hard for her to keep her focus on the trial. She was just all over the place.
Or maybe it didn't seal her fate. Maybe it made her look criminally insane.
Right. In his opening statements, the prosecutor read the indictment, against her for the murder in the first degree. They had to do that because there was really no other charge. If she's poisoning, it's premeditated.
Right.
A lot of people would have been happy if they could have just put her away in an insane asylum, but they legally could not do that.
Right.
She had to be charged. So
to get any kind of consequence, they have to charge her with the crime that she did.
Right.
They can't just change the facts.
Exactly. We see this time and time again, but they decided to just go after her for the murder of her father first.
Oh, yeah.
Because they thought even if she's found not guilty or, by reason of insanity, if she ever gets out of this mental hospital, then they're going to recharge her.
Right. Like that's a strategic move that they have used a lot historically.
Yeah. Which, I think is pretty smart.
I do too.
He described the murder, adding that Celia had confessed her crime to at least 12 different people, including newspaper reporters.
Once she started talking.
Yeah, she just kept on talking. She was loving it. So it was like she would kind of not show any interest in what was going on. But when her name was mentioned, they said she would bury her face in a handkerchief until they were done talking about her. Like she was kind of shy. Mm-hmm. Her defense, of course, was arguing, look, she's crazy. So George and Tracy, Tracy was her friend, Davis, they testified about her confession. Mm-hmm. There were some neighbors who testified. One girl testified that they thought she was insane because she would jump out and scare people. She would just kind of do inappropriate things. Mm-hmm. But the prosecutor was like, okay, that doesn't make her insane. I jump out and scare people all the time. Am I insane? And she was like, well, I just think for her age that, it's just off. And they kind of made a big joke of her. Her teachers talked about her mental status and how they just didn't think they just felt like she was really, really slow. One teacher talked about a time, I guess they would do these little plays at their school, and she was supposed to recite this poem. And on the day of the play, all she could do was hold the paper over her face. She was too shy. She wouldn't do it. The teacher said Ceely, she just didn't have a sound mind.
And I agree with that.
Yeah. She explained that, she just didn't act like other people, and especially not other girls her own age. Another teacher, Emma Holderman, testified for the defense and just said how, Ceely always stuttered and how she was embarrassed and how she was nervous. One day she got lost on the way to school in a rainstorm. They had to shut school down and everybody go look for her. And they finally found her, and she was soaking wet, just bawling, crying, scared to death. Aww. She was just very weak-minded.
Yeah.
The coroner testified that Rebecca Rose's organs had more arsenic in them than even David's or Walter's. Well, of course, because she had been poisoned twice.
Yeah.
A doctor who had examined Ceely asked her, why in the world did you murder your mom, Pa? And she said, well, I wanted to be the boss of my own house. I know. Another doctor that examined her had labeled her a sexual pervert and said that her inclinations were so strong that even human life and the life of her own family would be sacrificed if it stood in the line between her and the gratification of her desires. I disagree with that.
I do too. Honestly, I think a lot of doctors back then I think they labeled women who were whatever,
boys,
as sexual perverts. If you remember Christiana Edmonds, the story,
this
reminds me a little bit of that. She was labeled that too. Maybe she was very interested in men, but that doesn't make you a sexual pervert.
No.
And I think that was just a label, but I don't agree with it.
Oh, I don't either. And two, I just feel like she was kind of innocent. She wanted to be married and have kids. She wasn't raping or molesting children or boys or anybody.
Yeah.
So
to use the word pervert's kind of harsh.
It's very harsh.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One neighbor said that she never considered Celia just right. She just didn't think she was smart enough to know that murder was wrong. The testimonies were all over the place. Some were, they were like, she definitely did, but they found out. So the defense ended up kind of destroying the prosecution because they had some people in town testifying for the prosecutors, but they all ended up being related to him.
See, again, this story has so many different little layers.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
This reporter from the Daily Shield described her as having a careless demeanor and indifference to what was going on. She seemed to think it was all an entertainment gotten up in her honor and that all of her friends and neighbors in Monroe Township, they had just come to see her. Her face has worn the habitual smile of a timid, bashful schoolgirl. All the references to her mental condition didn't seem to cause any lively interest, although she would at times listen very intently to a witness for a short amount of time until her attention was diverted by some trivial happening when she would pay attention to the latter. He said also that in the county jail, he was able to make no progress with her until he started talking about Guy Berry. But on October 20th in 1896, Judge Wolfe instructed the jury and they went out, to deliberate. It took an hour and a half, 11:30. They came back with the verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity.
Oh, I was sitting, you said an hour and a half. I'm like, oh, they found her guilty.
Nope.
Oh, I'm so shocked.
Yeah.
They did?
They did.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
So she was found not guilty. That was premeditated.
It was. Now, today, I do not think that would be the case.
Yeah. I'm really shocked by that verdict.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
The prosecution at that time decided not to prosecute her for the murders of her brother and mother as long as she was put away. But if she was ever, like I mentioned before, let out of the hospital, they were going to go after her for the other charges. She was sent to the Toledo State Mental Hospital, and then later she was transferred to the Lima State Hospital. Ceely Rose was a favorite of the staff at both hospitals. She never had another violent spell or episode. The doctors and nurses and everybody loved her.
Wow.
Ceely loved to sew. She loved to read her Bible. She would do, chores around like homemaking stuff they would have her do. She had special privileges that other patients didn't have. From the minute she got locked up, she had a locket that her mother had given her when she was a young girl, and she wanted that locket so bad. She'd, worn it from the time her mother gave it to her. And it was really her most prized possession. And the only thing she had now from her family, her whole family was gone. Of course, they couldn't let her have it. It's a locket on a string.
Yeah,
she could kill somebody or kill herself.
Yeah.
But eventually, once they realized she wasn't dangerous, they let her wear it. And she wore it for the rest of her life. On the inside of the locket, there were these two tiny tintype pictures. On one side was her dad, and the other was her mom. And it was when they were young. It was probably from their engagement. Her health started to deteriorate in the 1920s, and she begged for years to go visit her family's graves. So some of the staff snuck her out one evening to the Pleasant Valley Cemetery, and they helped her to kneel down at her family's grave so that she could pray. It was said that Ceely would get down every single night in the hospital. I don't know why I'm going to cry. I don't know why I feel sorry for her, but every night she would bow down and she would pray just like her mom had taught her to do. She would clutch her little locket.
Now you're making me tear up.
I know. And she would pray that one day she would be reunited with her family.
Wow.
And so that was the end. She died in the 1930s of pneumonia. When she died, workers there who she had been his favorite, they were going to get rid of her locket, and he took it as actually they had this kind of like thing at their desk where they had some like memorabilia from the different patients that they really liked that were some of their favorites, and her locket was there. When some new administrators came in, they were like, you need to get rid of this stuff. Like, this is inappropriate. Y'all need to.
Yeah.
One of the janitors that was there whenever she was there, and he really loved her, he ended up taking it home. And so we've got a picture of that, and
okay.
with the mother and dad's pictures. But yeah, that is the story of the Ceely Rose murders.
Wow. Well, I don't want to say our end yet because I want to discuss it.
Yes. Tell me what your thoughts are.
Well, I've been jotting down notes because I didn't want to forget them all. Well, first of all, I was very shocked by that verdict, but I do think she ended up where she should be.
I do too.
Because with her mind being like it was, it would have been really sad for her to go to prison.
Yeah.
I don't know that she would have been safe there either. I think she would have been taken advantage of.
I
think she was where she needed to be in an asylum. So I think the verdict was right.
Yeah, me too.
That laugh that she had, that's at first you hear that and you're like, oh my gosh, that's
sounds
diabolical. But I do know there are people who laugh like that when they're nervous. Oh, there you are raising your hand.
I laugh when my babies would get their shots. It would make me so nervous. Like,
yes.
I hated it, but I looked like a terrible mother because I would be smiling.
But sometimes that is like it's a
nervous reaction.
Yes,
I always talk about how I laugh inappropriately.
Yeah, so I think, and there's probably a lot of our listeners who know exactly what you mean by that. So I don't know that necessarily means that she was evil. Could be that she was really nervous about getting caught or realizing what she had done or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's what I think about that. And then I'm not so sure that guy was not sleeping with her.
I know.
And leading her on a little bit. Maybe not at the beginning, but maybe after some time, he realized that was an easy thing for him to do.
Yep.
And he had no intention of marrying her, but maybe he was, because that comment she made to her friend about the medicine.
Yes.
That just gives me a little bit of a pause. And the fact that she was so obsessed with him.
Right.
Again, some stalkers have that behavior. Like, they convince themselves that you're in love with them. But I don't know. There is a part of me that thinks perhaps he really was on the sly, maybe sleeping with her.
And her friend was very surprised and taken aback that she knew what that was.
Yes.
And I mean,
how would she have known about it?
Yeah. The other thing is he was actually subpoenaed and was supposed to testify for the prosecution, and they ended up not putting him on the stand.
Oh, that makes me really suspicious.
Yeah. And so you got to wonder.
Yeah.
You definitely got to wonder.
I am very suspicious of that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So those are my thoughts. I mean,
if her mother could forgive her and her mother still wanted the best for her, her mother knew her better than anybody else.
Yeah.
Then I'm glad that she, I'm thankful for the verdict. I do think she needed to be in the hospital, but I think they treated her well.
Yeah.
And I think I agree that she was where she needed to be.
Yeah. And I don't know if those murders could have been avoided, I guess. Like some people are just going to grow up. Mm-hmm. Like she said, she'd been taught right from wrong. She knew it was wrong. But she finally quit pushing those voices away that told her not to do it. And with her mind to the way it was and her fascination with that boy, it may have been one of those things that it was going to happen.
Right.
One way or another. Not to excuse any of that. I'm just thinking through all of those different elements of that.
Right.
It's so sad, but
it's crazy because in some warps, I mean, I do believe she loved her family. It's such a terrible, sad, crazy story. But you can actually still visit Ceely Rose's farmhouse. And they do, these little ghost tours there now. But it's part of the Malabar Farms estates.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Well, those sure were some hard times.
Yes, they were.
Personally, I'm not going to drive to Ohio to see if Malabar Farms is really haunted, because I don't believe in ghosts. But I do believe if you go searching around for evil spirits, Satan will be more than glad to oblige. But if you are the sort that believes in ghosts, will you make sure you tell everybody living, and a few people dead, to check out Hard Times and True Crimes. Till next time, goodbye.